Hi. So I just watched the Odyssey and I really want to review it and talk about it and things that I saw that I think are worth dissecting. So we're gonna do that here. All right. So the movie starts with the shot of the horse, right? The Trojan horse that we're all very familiar with in one version or the other. It was very dramatic, very mythic, but there was something very, very disorienting about the horse that we saw. Odysseus in this shot, we don't know where he is, right? And that feeling of disorientation is the central theme of the story. That's basically what we're tracing throughout the story, as if what happened to Odysseus during the entire film, right? What was his journey, right? Now, it is a tale of a man who no longer knows what home means. Now, this was very important and special to me personally because I was a Percy Jackson fan and like a Greek myth fan ever since I was, I think, 11 or 12. And to watch this as an adult was lovely. So I might nerd out here and there. Please bear with me. Thank you. Okay, so we get introduced to the main characters fairly quickly. Penelope, Telemachus, we get introduced to the suitors, one of which is the Robert Pattinson character, and he looks very fine in that, by the way. Uh, so we see that there are a lot of suitors who have, you know, stepped into Odysseus's palace or his home within his absence. And then gradually we try to understand through the film, where has Odysseus been throughout these years, right? Where did we see him? That is the question that we're exploring. Oh, I'm not going to be talking about the plot too much, but more about the analysis because I think most of us do know at least some version of the Odyssey, right? So there is Troy, there's the wooden horse, which is Odysseus's great idea, right? That allows the Greeks to enter the city. Now, there is a journey home that happens. That journey becomes increasingly catastrophic. There is Polyphemus, the Cyclops, and the son of Poseidon that they made an enemy. There is Circe. I love her, Circe. We're going to talk about her in detail. There is also the journey into the underworld. There are the sirens, Cicala, and another monster whose name I don't know how to pronounce, but I'll put it somewhere. The cattle of Helios, the death of Odysseus's men, and finally Calypso. Okay, so after years of being away, he finally comes home to Ithaca. Apologies. Hi, apologies, but this is where we're gonna film this from. I hope that's fine. Okay. Now, what is interesting to me is not necessarily, the journey, which is lovely, and Nolan has showed it to us in a way where 3 hours do not feel that long, which is a feat in itself. What was interesting and the way that he depicted what war does to a person, and also it talks about war in a larger sense, right? War, what does it do to you, and what does it do to us? That is a question that Nolan has explored through his film, and that's what we get to see, right? Because in my opinion, what this version of Odyssey does is not necessarily what war has done to us collectively, but it explores what it does to a human being, right? So Odysseus, he is obviously painted as a hero, right? We're supposed to admire him for his intelligence, his courage, his ability to survive. But he was also the man who came up with the idea of the Trojan horse. And then you think about the morality of ideas, right? And are you really evil if you gave an idea that essentially then destroyed the whole civilization, right? That is the question that it tackles with. Because the Trojan horse, of course, was a brilliant idea, but it was also a horrifying idea, similar to the nuclear bombs that we have, which is again something that Nolan had explored through Oppenheimer. And the dilemma of a man who has made something so brilliant and yet so destructive. This is again something that comes up in this film. So that's something I think that Nolan likes to discuss through his work. And I love to see filmmakers being obsessed with a specific theme that they talk about again and again. Because yeah, that's how psyches work. So yeah, I love Nolan for that. So anyways, um, in the film, Nolan tells us how Odysseus' brilliance is the thing that destroyed an entire city, right? Innocent people are killed. Odysseus says that war is the thing that is destroying all that is sacred between man, right? The film again and again brings up Zeus's law. The Zeus's law basically states that you want to treat people how you want to be treated, which is a basic principle that we're taught as children, which we often forget. Now, Odysseus says that his idea of a horse basically violated all that was sacred between men. The idea of giving a gift and that being the thing that destroys men is when trust was eroded between people, according to him. Right? Now, when Odysseus sees all of this happening, right, he has to live with that knowledge and he bears great responsibility of the thing that he gave. On his shoulders, we see the weight of the violence, even though it was not a violence that he had done himself, but we still see it, right? It was his idea that made the violence possible, and that is what weighs on him throughout the entire film. So, yeah, there's that. Now, if you create a strategy, right, that is leading the world to ruin, how responsible are you for what you've created? Or is it separate? Like, that is something which is very interesting, right? And where does responsibility begin and end when in war? Are only the people who are physically committing the violence responsible, or is it the people who are planning the violence equally responsible? What about the people who are participating within the war that are being ordered to do that? What about those people who are benefiting from it? And at what point does this participation become complicity? Right? And perhaps most disturbingly, at what point are people made complicit by the systems that are around them? And this is also something that we explore through Zimbardo's very unethical experiment. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but I will link it below if you want to like learn more about it. So I think this is where Odysseus became much more interesting to me than the conventional idea of a triumphant Greek hero, right? Because his journey home is not simply a journey which is delayed again and again by monsters and by gods. Odysseus, we see, is a man who is carrying the psychological burden of Troy within him, right? And that is the question that Nolan is asking us as audience, or is making us reflect. What is the thing that we have done to each other, right? And that is one of the most devastating questions that we can ask, because often war stories they'll tell you those about with like who won, who lost, right? But war is about putting everything at stake that we as humanity value, right? Things like beauty, art, love, family, memory, religion, and civilization itself is put at stake. Now the Greeks had destroyed Troy in order to win a war. Now, but in doing so, what exactly was the thing that they proved, right? Now, the Greeks had destroyed Troy in order to win a war, but in doing so, what exactly have they proven themselves superior to? That is the question. Now, Odysseus survives Troy, but survival does not mean that Troy has ended for him. He carries it home. And that is where Penelope becomes so important. I'm going to sit here for like a couple of minutes and just obsess over Anne Hathaway, and you're going to listen to it. Okay, so this is where Anne Hathaway absolutely stole it from me because she talks. So, the women in this film are awesome, and I love the questions that it begs for us. They are still very, very relevant. Okay, so Hathaway performed Penelope perfectly, and I think she was very well cast for this, in my opinion. There was a lot of longing in her performance. Her eyes portray a lot. And there's also the soundtrack that goes on, when they meet and when they're together, and that made me cry, which is a big deal because So any movie that makes me cry automatically goes to the. Okay, anyway, so Penelope is longing for Odysseus, obviously, but also the strange cruelty of being loyal to someone who has become almost mythical, right? There are people, there are bards singing about Odysseus, and you have no idea where your husband is. Now, she is a person who's been waiting for her husband for years. That's the thing. She hasn't been sitting still. She's been ruling. She's been protecting Ithaca, right? She's been raising their son. She's the one who is navigating the constant presence and pressure of the suitors, right? So there's a conversation between Penelope and Telemachus, and she talks about being a woman ruler. And there's this podcast called "Let's Talk About Myths, Baby" by Liv, I think Liv or Liz. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that. I'll insert it somewhere. Wherein she she jokingly talks again and again about the disrespect that people had for women in ancient Greece, and that is something that Penelope is able to show through, right? So she has this conversation where she's talking about how she's been queen and she's taken care of the kingdom and has not been valued for it, and that is something that stayed with me, right? Because Odysseus gets home, he becomes a legend, and Penelope has to stay still, be a good wife, and maintain the world that he left behind. Look at Odysseus, his absence is something which is heroic, but Penelope is, her being a good wife and her endurance is something which is expected. Now, this story, I think, is also a love story in a way. Not a simple romantic one, but it's about love that stays, love that endures, through time, through distance, through people changing through that time, right? And because Odysseus, when he leaves and when he comes home, he's not the same person, right? So, what is Penelope waiting for? Is it the man? Is it the memory? Is it the idea of the person that she was in love with? And when Odysseus finally comes back, the question is, can you really love someone after knowing all the things that they had to survive, right? And that also brings me to Odysseus's own loyalty, which is something that I find complicated within their marriage, because we have Calypso, right? And depending on how you interpret their relationship, you do inevitably question, did Odysseus cheat on Penelope? And the more interesting question is, so Calypso was poisoning him, okay, so that he could not, he could heal, right? But he could not remember. Then she said that you always do come back to yourself. Now, the thing is, through all the years that he was being poisoned, he tried to remember, but he did not want to go home. And that is the question, right? I kept wondering, why did Odysseus not want to return even though he loved his family, right? Because when you choose to go home, you choose to remember the person that you were before the war. And most importantly, it is a question of confronting the person that you have become now, right? So maybe Calypso's island for Odysseus is not simply a prison, it was also a form of escape. And there was a line in it as well, wherein Odysseus says that if this happiness breaks away, then it was never really happiness, right? What him and Calypso had. So that is something that I still think about. Um, Now I'm gonna talk about the women in this film at length. Okay. I loved all the women in this adaptation. Of course, I'm a fan of Circe, my favorite badass. So Circe is very powerful in her own right. She is not someone who's like a part of Odysseus' journey. Sure, she is, but I highly recommend that you read Madeline Miller's Circe because that's how I was introduced to her as a character. Now, Circe is someone who understands men, and she also understands what men returning from war are capable of. She talks to Odysseus, and when she turns his men into pigs, he finally comes looking for them, and then she says that you know who your men are. These are men who have spent years raping, killing, and pillaging, and that is what you call discipline. We call them soldiers, we call them heroes. Then Circe asks you, Is this really discipline, or is this war? And war creating a world wherein worst things people can do to each other are okay and they are rewarded, right? What I love about Cersei is that she is a figure which is disrupting the traditional idea of power, right? Men enter her world thinking that they are powerful, but they're not, and they're very vulnerable towards her. And she is a beautiful character conceptually. I mean, she has her own authority, her own morality, her own relationship with power, and she feels like a counterpoint to the entire patriarchal world that Odysseus is coming from. Now, Calypso is different but equally interesting, right? Penelope is waiting for Odysseus, Circe is confronting him, and Calypso is making him forget. And I think each of these women are also trying to help us understand the relationship that Odysseus has with himself, right? Now, another part of this film that I loved was Hades, and so he tries to get back to the underworld. Visually, the entire sequence was beautiful. It was haunting, and you could still feel the grief of all the men that Odysseus had to leave behind, all the men that did not get the burial, right? And sacrifice was also something that this film aimed to capture really well, because Agamemnon had sacrificed his own daughter so that the Greeks could have favorable winds and could sail to Troy, right? Now, he sacrificed someone he loved for war, which is sickening, right? And eventually, that sacrifice is the thing that leads him to his own death, right? When his wife kills him. And there is something very cyclical about that. Violence is creating violence, right? This sacrifice is demanding another sacrifice. The dead do not simply disappear simply because we choose to move on, right? I loved that in relation to Odysseus' journey. Now, Odysseus, throughout the film, again and again, encounters the dead, remembers them, and in the end, he chooses to honor them as well. So, coming home is also the idea of dealing with all that you have lost, all the people that you have lost. Right? I also absolutely adored the way that they portrayed the gods, or rather, how they weren't portrayed. Let me explain. So, the gods in this film are everywhere, right? Athena, Poseidon, Zeus, Helios, their presence is something that you feel constantly as the audience. But the thing is that these gods do not show up as enormous, spectacular, supernatural beings who are controlling everything. What is interesting is that their power feels very psychological. They exist through these visions, through the guilt, through nature, through fate. And I absolutely love that because you can interpret the gods quite literally, of course. This is the Greek mythology. But you can also see how they manifest within the collective psyche. The way that people are trying to understand the world that they simply cannot control. The sea becomes Poseidon, wisdom is Athena, the sun becomes Helios, right? And nature becomes populated with this intention because it is easier to accept that a god is angry with you than to accept that the ocean simply does not care whether or not you survive or not. And psychologically, Athena's presence is very, very important because Odysseus cannot escape this judgment. Whether Athena is actually haunting him or whether it is this idea of the high priestess that he had to kill, this is the shape that his guilt takes on. He sees her because something within Odysseus demands for it to be seen, right? And in the end, there was a bow and arrow sequence that felt very Bollywood to me in the best way possible. So you have Odysseus, who's still disguised, surrounded by men who underestimate him. Penelope basically said that she'll marry anyone who can string Odysseus's bow. Everyone is failing, and then there is a mysterious stranger. He strings the bow, he makes the shot, and suddenly everyone knows it's him. And the hero has returned, and then he kills everyone. It is very dramatic, it's very satisfying. We all love a good hero reveal. And strangely, it was also something that reminded me of Arjuna and the swayamvar. So there was an impossible test of skill, the only weapon that a true hero can master, and an identity reveal. So there is something very satisfying about like that archetype in general. Now I also think the ending is something that complicates the satisfaction because after everything that Odysseus has, experienced, his ending is something which is marked by violence. He comes home from a war and there is another massacre, which makes you wonder if a person who's been through war can actually leave it behind. And that is also like a metaphorical war, right? And otherwise, of course. So, can Odysseus actually be the man that he was? Or is the idea of returning truly impossible, right? That is something that we see. So, yeah, that was basically Odyssey for me. I rated it 5 out of 5. And yeah, I love this film. I think everyone should go and watch it. I'm sorry if I spoiled it for you. I tried my best not to with most things, and I think you'll enjoy it. It is visually and the IMAX experience itself was stunning and lovely. So, yeah, have fun, enjoy your movie going experience, and this was my analysis. Thank you for watching. Bye.